I think most people who have watched Sherlock Holmes: A Game of Shadows can agree that Professor James Moriarty was a terrifying villain. His intellect was only matched by Sherlock himself, and he was at the verge of single-handedly starting a world war. So this kinda made me wonder, just how dangerous can he get? So that's what this video is going to be about. But before that, here's a quick summary of the plot. It's the year 1891 and there's a series of bombings happening all throughout Europe. And most people think it's the anarchists or the nationalists who are behind all this. However, Sherlock Holmes quickly theorizes that the mastermind behind all this is James Moriarty. Eventually, we find out that Moriarty's plan was to generate an insane amount of fortune by causing a world war and profiting off of the shares he owns in several war profiteering companies. This leads to Sherlock and Moriarty playing a game of cat and mouse, each consistently trying to one-up each other as Sherlock tries to prevent the war, while Moriarty tries to get rid of Sherlock and his friend Dr. Watson. So back to the question, just how dangerous is he? Well, to answer this question, I'm going to be analyzing Moriarty based on his physical capabilities, his potential weaknesses, and of course his intellect. So to begin, let's start with the easiest one to measure, his physical capabilities. I find it kinda ironic that the ability which Moriarty has used the least in the movie was the easiest one for me to analyze. Technically, he never got into a physical fight with anyone, and the only maybe remarkable physical thing he did was surviving this. However, I'd say luck played a bigger role in this one. However, in a number of instances, it is heavily implied that he is indeed a formidable fighter. A great example of this is shown when, just like Sherlock Holmes himself, it's revealed that Moriarty can also use Sherlock vision.
Come now. You really think you're the only one who can play this game? Trap arm. Target weakness. Follow with haymaker.
And based on the fact that Moriarty and Sherlock arrived at the exact same conclusion when they both used their Sherlock visions at the same time, I think it's fair to say that Moriarty's Sherlock vision is just as good as that of Sherlock's. Moriarty might not be the most physically imposing guy out there, but anybody with future sight is going to be extremely difficult to take down, which leads me to my next point. Another instance where Moriarty's high combat skills are implied is when he was able to beat Sherlock in a one-on-one brawl. Now some might argue that the fight actually never happened because it was just the two of them using Sherlock vision at the same time, but based on what the two movies by Guy Ritchie suggests, Sherlock is pretty much never wrong when it comes to his Sherlock vision. So I'm just gonna assume whatever he and Moriarty saw was pretty much what was gonna happen if they actually fought. That is, of course, assuming Watson didn't walk in, of course, which we'll get to later. Here, Sherlock had a disadvantage because he had taken a hook to his shoulder just a few days ago, but even considering this, being able to beat Sherlock in a one-on-one is still really impressive. Cause you gotta remember, Sherlock Holmes at the start of the film beat 4 armed men all on his own. I'm pretty sure fighting one man while using just one arm is much easier than fighting a bigger guy with a revolver, a man with brass knuckles, another guy with a knife, and Ben Affleck's twin with a billy club, all at the same time. Also, another thing I have to mention is that the fight between Sherlock and Moriarty wasn't even close. The fight seems much longer than it actually is because we only see it through Sherlock vision. However, we have to keep in mind the actual fight would have lasted much shorter. When looking at the underground fight scene from the first Sherlock Holmes movie, we can see here that the fight when seen through Sherlock vision took about 35 seconds, while the actual fight only took about 7 seconds. Applying the same ratio to the Moriarty fight, which took about 61 seconds, we can deduce that the actual fight would have only taken about 12 seconds. Whether Sherlock was injured or not, incapacitating a man who pretty much has future sight in just 12 seconds, I'd say is an incredible achievement. When we think about Moriarty, I think this is what most people immediately think of, and for good reason. After all, he was the only one who put up a good fight against Sherlock in a battle of intellect. His plan to anonymously buy shares in war profiteering industries and causing a world war to happen to create demand sounds quite intelligent. But to understand just how thought out this plan is, we have to break it down and try to understand what each step of the plan was intended for. In this scene where Sherlock reveals his diorama to Watson, it's shown in one of the newspaper articles that an Indian cotton tycoon had stood down as president. When we look closely, we can see here that it says, "The gentleman stood down as president of the company very abruptly." Rumors are rife concerning this sudden resignation, and there is much speculation between workers and fellows to what may have instigated his decisions. The tycoon's company has taken over the... Unfortunately, the movie doesn't show what comes after, but based on context clues, I'm pretty sure the next word was company. The part where we have to pay attention to is where it says the tycoon's partner has taken over the company. This connects back to the weapon factory scene where Moriarty's plans are revealed by Sherlock and he says this.
Under various pseudonyms you bought, schemed, or murdered your way into numerous industries, assuring that none of it could be traced to you. Cotton, opium, steel, now arms and chemical weaponry.
To understand what's so genius about this, we need to know a little bit of history. The Game of Shadows is set in the Victorian era, which was a time when England and India were two of the biggest cotton manufacturers in the entire world. If a war were to break out and England limited the cotton exports to certain countries, the logical thing for those countries to do would be to buy cotton from India, where a large percent of it is owned by Moriarty. But that still isn't it. There's even a bigger secret to Moriarty's plan. Because of the way Moriarty chose which companies to buy, together with the way he positioned himself in the British government, he would not only profit off of the war, but also have some control over the outcome of the war itself. This is kinda hard to explain, so I'll break it down a bit. Moriarty has done two fundamental things to take control over the war. For one, he earned the British government's trust to the point where they ask him to take part in making huge decisions for the country. He's a personal friend of the Prime Minister, and was also brought in to advise on the peace process, which is a place where a single disagreement could lead to a world war. And on top of this, when Mycroft, who's like a member of the British Secret Service, handed over a telegram that reveals Moriarty's plans to his superiors, they didn't seem to care at all.
Didn't you find it strange that the telegram you sent didn't inspire any action to stop me?
At this point, I think it's clear how much the British government trusts Moriarty, but to swing the outcome of a war, simply having control over Britain would not suffice. You'd also need to control the other countries that are also involved in the war, which Moriarty has. To understand this, again, we have to go back to the diorama scene. This time, we're going to be focusing on this. During a war, steel is one of, or if not the most important commodity. From guns to tanks, helmets, everything used in war has some steel in its composition. And from what Sherlock said in the factory scene in Germany,
Under various pseudonyms you bought, schemed, or murdered your way into numerous industries, assuring that none of it could be traced to you. Cotton, opium, steel, now arms and chemical weaponry.
it's pretty obvious that Moriarty has control over this American steel company. This connects back to that time when Moriarty assassinated Alfred Meinhardt to acquire the huge weapon manufacturer in Germany. This is a pretty big deal because in the year 1891, the top 3 producers of steel were England, Germany, and America. At this point, Moriarty already owned a huge share of an enormous steel company in America. And on top of this, he had full control over England from the trust he had from the British government. And on top of this, also owned a large weapon manufacturer in Germany. This basically means he had control over the top 3 producers of steel and weaponry in the entire world. By doing things like intentionally disrupting the exportation of steel and weaponry to certain countries, Moriarty would easily be able to sway the outcome of the war. After all, winning a war would be impossible without any steel and weaponry. Okay, now that we discussed his strengths, let's talk about his potential weaknesses. Moriarty overall is an extremely formidable guy. He's intelligent, strong, but he isn't perfect. I'd say the main weakness Moriarty has is his lack of emotional control. For the most part, Moriarty does a splendid job of acting like a normal guy, which I think is how he managed to obtain the trust of the British government. However, there were two instances when Moriarty completely fails to maintain his emotions and suffers the consequences for it. The first instance where Moriarty loses control over his emotions is when he interrogates Holmes in the weapon factory. Here, Moriarty finds out Sherlock had sent a telegram to somebody, which might have contained information regarding Moriarty's plans. So, he sticks a hook in Holmes' shoulder and pulls him up. But then, Moriarty kinda loses his emotional control and goes full-on psychopath mode, singing The Trout by Schubert while tearing up Holmes' shoulder by pushing and pulling him down. Although he did kinda go psychopath mode here, it did work out for Moriarty because Holmes actually tells him who the telegram was sent to.
To whom did you send the telegram? To my brother, Mycroft.
So I'll give him a pass on this one. However, what's not okay is what he did next. After Holmes answered his question, Moriarty asks this.
I've just got one more question for you. Which one of us is the fisherman, and which the trout?
Don't get me wrong, it's an awesome scene, but this is a huge problem because if he had just killed Sherlock instead of wasting time being poetic like this, he could have avoided getting his notebook stolen and almost getting crushed to death by a building. Like seriously, if this wasn't his lucky day, he would have died here. Now you might say, hold on a second, maybe Moriarty thought Sherlock was lying or something. So he asked the Trout question to intimidate him or something. But no, that isn't the case because, for one, Moriarty said the Trout question was his final question, and on top of this, it doesn't make sense that Moriarty would assume Sherlock is lying because, when you think about it, there's no point. The recipient of the telegram, Mycroft, was basically the worst person it could have been sent to from Moriarty's perspective. Because, think about it, is there any person who could jeopardize Moriarty's position in the government more than somebody who is a high-ranking member of that same government body? At this point, I'm pretty sure Moriarty already knew that the higher-ups trust him enough that a simple allegation without any evidence isn't gonna jeopardize his position in the government. And finally, if he didn't intend on killing Sherlock yet, I'm pretty sure he would have reminded Moran not to kill him in this scene.
I'm alright. I'm alright. Don't waste time attending to me. Vite! I'll find him. I'll find him.
So instead of going full psychopath mode and savoring the moment of victory, he should have definitely just killed Sherlock here for good. But the mistake Moriarty made here doesn't even come close to what he did at the climax of the movie. At the earlier parts of the scene, Moriarty does a pretty good job of keeping his emotions under control. Even when he finds out that the plan to assassinate a world leader had failed and is unable to start a world war now, he doesn't seem to be that bothered by it, telling Sherlock that all he has to do is wait and war is inevitable. However, when Sherlock reveals that he had secretly stolen his notebook and had cracked the code to find where his fortunes are hidden, he gets mad. Like, really mad. So mad, in fact, that just as he was about to take Sherlock down in a physical fight, he completely forgets about the possibility of Watson joining in the fight. But actually, rage wasn't even the biggest problem here. The biggest cause of Moriarty's death wasn't his rage, but rather his psychopathic tendencies. And here's why. As Moriarty is taken over by rage and his psychopathic nature, and says this,
Once we've concluded our business here, it's It's important, you know. I shall endeavor to find the most creative of endings for the Doctor. And his wife.
He doesn't even consider the possibility of Sherlock sacrificing himself to protect Watson. What I think happened here is that because Moriarty went full psychopath mode, any action of empathy such as self-sacrifice was beyond his comprehension at this point, which was probably why he failed to predict Sherlock's sacrifice move. If only he would have controlled his emotions and didn't try to physically fight Sherlock here, I'm pretty sure his plan wouldn't have ended up being a complete fiasco. Overall, I think Moriarty is an extremely dangerous man. His intelligence makes sure nobody can get close to him, and even if anybody did get close to him, he still has his Sherlock vision. He was at the verge of single-handedly starting a world war, and without Sherlock, I'm pretty sure nobody would have stopped him. But because it's the late 1900s we're talking about, the most that could happen from a world war at this time would be a multi-country scale mass genocide. Without atom bombs, airplanes, and bioweapons, anything beyond that is pretty much impossible. So if I were to put Moriarty in a danger to humanity tier list, with S tier being a world-ending threat and D tier being a normal person, I'd say he belongs in A tier.